Hi everyone, this is Bo from Bo to Fitness, and today we're going to be looking at how to figure out your daily carbohydrate intake for maximum fat loss. So we're specifically looking at carbohydrate intake in the context of setting up a fat loss diet. There are a few factors that we're going to want to consider before we get to our actual calculations, and then I just want to cover these quickly. So remember, the first thing to think about when it comes to manipulating carbohydrate is the quality of the carbohydrate you're consuming as it is right now versus the quantity. In other words, it's not just all about reducing the amount of carbs in your diet to lose weight, but it is about the quality of the carbs that you're consuming right now. Oftentimes, a person can continue to eat exactly the same amount of carbohydrates that they're eating right now, but just simply swap them out for healthier alternatives. And this is especially because people tend to be very confused about carbohydrate when it comes to what actually constitutes carbohydrates. Some people are convinced that carbs are like donuts and bagels and bread and pasta, and that things like vegetables they don't oftentimes attribute as being carbohydrate, but we would classify fiber and vegetables and fruits and things like this all in that carbohydrate category. So obviously, if my diet is made up of mostly Pop-Tarts and bagels and bread and pasta, and I swap it out for vegetables, I could still eat as much carbohydrate, but I'm going to be having a lot more food, a lot fewer overall calories because the nature of that fiber is more fibrous, so I won't be able to absorb quite as many of those calories. So sometimes the biggest thing is to just simply focus on the quality of the carbohydrates you're consuming already. So that's something that we want to consider. Another thing we want to look at is the timing of carbs. So another thing we can get some advantages with carbohydrate is eating the right kinds of carbs at the right times. And what I mean by that is that generally speaking, you want to be thinking of carbohydrate as fuel. It is the fuel that really is especially with physical activity. And we know that if you're relatively sedentary or inactive, then you probably don't need a lot of carbohydrate to be obviously fueling inactivity, right? So what you would want instead is to have types of carbohydrates that are very low glycemic and high fibrous. So think vegetables, right? So the days, or more specifically, the times of day that you're not doing a lot of activity, then you want to really keep your meals vegetable focused, and you're going to limit the sugary, starchy, processed carbohydrates. Right, so you might, for example, let's say that you get up in the morning and you're going right to work, and your work is, a desk job where you're going to be sitting for a long period of time. Then that means a good breakfast might be an omelet with a bunch of chopped vegetables, and you're not going to be throwing into that, orange juice or bread or bagels or any of that kind of stuff, because that's going to knock you right out. Maybe at most you might add a small serving of fruit. So if you want some berries or an orange with that breakfast, that might be fine. But we want to try to keep the carbs relatively low in that breakfast meal. However, carbs prior to high intensity exercise, such as weight training or interval training, and even sometimes after training as a recovery and just to get your energy back up, can be great. And that would be the types of carbs where you could have your starches, your fruits, your whole grains, things like that. So I think like your potatoes, your brown rice or your purple rice, or sweet potatoes, things like that. Those are going to be great recovery and pre-workout foods. Fruits, same thing. Before and after high intensity exercise. And I don't mean immediately before or immediately after, but I mean you're going to want to be thinking of consuming those things prior to those types of activities. Fiber target. Another thing to bear in mind is that if you're tracking your carbs, you want to pay attention to when you get to the end of the day and you've eaten all your carbs, what's your fiber look like? Because if we get to the end of the day, let's say, and you've met your carb quota, let's say, and you look at your fiber and it's like 5 grams of fiber, 10 grams of fiber, 12 grams of fiber, then our fiber's too low. We want to try to get our fiber up to 35 grams minimum, in most cases up to 55, and it can be higher than that depending on how well you tolerate it. Many people need to slowly add in fiber and work it up there till your microbiome can adjust. Remember that our ancestors were eating much more fiber than this. Some studies have shown over 100 grams of fiber a day. From different types of plants. So we want to really try to get our fiber up there because of all the benefits it's going to have with satiety, our hormone regulation, our fat loss, cholesterol, you name it. Fiber is like this superfood when it comes to our health. Activity level. Another thing to consider with carbohydrate intake is what is your activity level like? If you're a very, very active person, you do a lot of high intensity interval training, weight training, things like that, then you're going to have more calories overall if you're entering in your data correctly. And the extra calories that you'll be consuming would largely come from carbohydrate, not necessarily coming from extra fat and protein. And that's mainly because when we go back and we look at how we set up our protein and how we set up our carbohydrate, our fats, we've already set them to optimal levels. So in fact, one of the ways that we make this diet very simple, this way of eating very simple, is that we really, once we've set our protein and once we've set our fat intake, we're going to keep them relatively constant. And the only variable we really got to tweak is going to be our carbohydrate moving forward. And that is what makes this so simple when it comes to fat loss, is rather than trying to, now I got to change my protein, now I got to change my fat, now I got to change my carbs. No, we're just going to change one thing, and that's going to be our overall carbohydrate intake to coax fat loss as we go. Carbohydrate is sort of like the brakes and the gas pedal when it comes to fat loss. You eat too much, you end up slowing fat loss down. Eat too little, you end up, again, negatively impacting fat loss. So we want that sweet spot. And it's going to take a little trial and error to get there, and a little bit of slowly lowering the carbohydrate intake over time to get to this ideal spot for each one of us. So I guess the takeaway there, if you want to eat more carbs, do lots more activity. Be very active. If you are a very inactive person, your carbohydrate intake is going to be lower. But then again, so are your calories. Number 5, water weight and fat loss. Notice the word carbohydrate. When we eat carbohydrate, our body sucks up and stores a lot of water along with it. So our weight goes up, our water weight goes up when we eat lots of carbohydrate. And these can be big fluctuations on the scale. And this is something that I want to point out, because many people, they'll start eating more carbs, they'll see their weight go up, and they're like, oh my God, I'm getting fat eating all these carbs. No, not necessarily. What's typically happening here is that your water weight is going up, and this is a good thing. You're hydrating your muscles, you're storing more carbohydrate in the liver. It's unlikely that, in most cases, carbohydrates rarely stored as body fat, so we don't usually have to worry about that too much unless you're eating a lot of excess carbohydrate and fats at the same time. But don't be concerned initially about weight gain when you eat more carbohydrate. This is especially because what we know is that when you are eating more carbs, you can actually gain water weight while losing fat at the same time. So your scale weight can go up, but your body fat percentage can go down at the same time. And so, and in fact, I tell this to people all the time. They'll get on the scale, they'll see their weight go up a little bit, and they start freaking out. I'm like, hey, you might have lost a decent amount of fat from yesterday, but you're freaking out because your scale weight's gone up. Whoop-de-doo, that might just be some water weight there, and those are the fluctuations we see that are very dramatic. We don't tend to see dramatic fat loss fluctuations day to day. That happens more over time. Lastly, tweaking of carbs for fat loss. I kind of touched on this a little bit. 2 variables we really want to think about. One way to tweak your fat loss with carbs is to just simply adjust and shift your carb intake more from the sugary, starchy, processed carbs toward those fibrous, low glycemic carbs, like the vegetables, the non-starchy vegetables. And then the other thing we want to think about is, as we're trying to coax fat off, we're going to start with our carbs relatively high, and once our weight loss plateaus, we're going to cut about 10 grams of carbs out at a time, and that's about 40 calories. So 10 grams, 10 times 4, there are 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, and that's where that number comes from. So you're going to keep cutting about 10 grams at a time, but you want to not cut that 10 grams out until you really hit a plateau. And this is especially if you're logging accurately. So remember, if you're not tracking your carbs, then more than likely you have no clue if you're eating the appropriate amount. Also, another thing I just want to throw out there, I didn't put it on my list, but it's worth mentioning. Many people mistakenly attribute their weight gain to carbs that are really blends, carbohydrate and fat blends. So they eat, pasta with, burger and butter all over, olive oil. They'll eat bread with peanut butter and jelly on it. They'll eat pizza with cheese on it. They'll eat cookies, chips, French fries, and these things a lot of people tend to think of as carbs, when in all reality, they're carb fat blends. And those kinds of blends are very weight gain promoting. And it's not the carbs alone that are the problem. It's the fact that they're blended with a lot of fat. And in many cases, the fats make up a greater percentage than the carbohydrate. So you look at some common foods, for example, like most chips are 56% fat. So you think about it, you're eating a potato chip, and do you think fat? No, you tend to think carbs. But you do a little calculations there, and you find out that 56% of that potato chip that you put in your mouth, in most cases, unless you're getting like a fat-free or a low-fat chip or something, is coming from fat. And that is very weight gain promoting when you mix carbs and fats together, which we're going to actually be talking about in our next video when we look at some of the worst foods for weight loss. These are the foods that actually promote weight gain and food addiction. We're going to be looking at that in our next video, so make sure you check that one out. So let's get to our calculations here so you can figure out your carbohydrate intake. This one's actually pretty simple because now that you have watched our protein intake video, you know how to factor protein, you've watched our fat intake video, now it's really easy to figure out carbs. Carbs is whatever is left, right? So now what that means is, let's just say that you figured out your protein intake, and we'll just say that it is, let's say, I'm just going to make these numbers up. Let's say it's 150 grams. So 150 times 4, I'm on the spot here. What's 150 times 4? 150, that's 300, 600 calories, I think. So there are 4 calories per gram. So see, 150 times 2, that's 300, right? 300, yeah, 600. So 600 calories from protein. Fat intake, let's just make this up. Let's say, again, let's say 50. So there are 9 calories per gram of fat. So we're going to multiply 50 grams of fat times 9, which gives us 450 calories. And that's, again, if I did my math right here, which I don't know. And then, so that's our protein in calories. That is our fat in calories. Based upon your own individual calculations there. And then whatever is left over is going to be your carb intake. So let's just say that the person is aiming for 2,000 calories. They figured that out. They've entered that in and figured out their calculations. So what we're going to do is we're going to put your total calories, so in this case 2,000, and we're going to subtract from it our protein and our fat intake in calories. So our protein is 600, our fat is 450, so that's 1,050 calories. Right, so 2,000 minus 1,050. Again, if I did my math there, right? So that means that our leftover calories is 950 calories from carbs. But we want to also know what that is in grams, right? So if we're going to figure this out in grams, we need to divide this by 4 because, like protein, there are 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. So we got to divide that 950 by 4, and this one I'm going to use a calculator because math is not my forte. 950 divided by 4 gives us 237. So 0.5. So we'll say 238. 238 grams of carbs. That would be my starting point based upon the calculations that we have here. And again, I just made those up to give you an example. Now, that person on 238 grams of carbs, remember, they are going to try to split them up evenly throughout the day when you create your meals. So now some people have said, but if you're supposed to have carbs, some timing them, how do you just divide the carbs up evenly? Don't you want to have more carbs at some meals and less carbs at others? Not necessarily. What you can do is split your carbs up somewhat evenly in your 5 meals. But what you would do is prior to your high intensity workout, you would have those higher starchy, the potatoes, the rice, those types of carbs. And whereas on your low carb meals, your lower carb meals, you're still going to have a lot of carbs, but they're going to be mostly non-starchy vegetables, right? So you're still going to have that same amount. So let's say that you do your calculations and it comes out to be about roughly 45 grams of carbs per meal. Then you'd have 45 grams of potato in your pre-workout meal, let's say, or fruit. Whereas on your other inactive times of the day, your 45 grams of carbs are going to be coming predominantly from fibrous vegetables. So anyways, hopefully that was helpful for you figuring out carb intake. If you have any more questions, you can contact me personally at Boda Fitness. I can help you set up your own carbs, fats, protein, macros. I can help you set up a meal plan. I can even help you create meals if you'd like, if that's helpful for you. And stay tuned for our next video. In our next video, we're going to be looking at the worst foods you can eat that make you really fat. And you're going to find this one very, very interesting. So hope you guys watch that one too. Talk to you soon.